Good evening. I'm Peter Colopy, Caltech's University Archivist, and I'd like to welcome you all to the sixth and final edition of our series, Becoming Caltech: Presentations from the Archives. I'd like to introduce the three presenters who we will have this evening, who are going to be Heidi Aspaturian, our senior editor and interviewer in the Caltech Archives, Elisa Picchio, archivist for digital collection development, and Loma Karklins, archivist for reader services. So we will have an opportunity in a moment to hear presentations from the three of them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that you'll be able to see those and follow along, and the three of us will disappear from your screens for the moment. And so our three presentations this evening will be entitled Caltech Takes to the Air, the Flyboys and the Science Guys, the Cosmopolitan Club and Students of Color, and thirdly, Origins of the Athenaeum. And so I will turn it over to Heidi for our first presentation, Caltech Takes to the Air.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This photo from the Caltech Archives collection was taken in 1910 at the first Boston-Harvard Air Meet. The man on the left is Wilbur Wright, who with his brother Orville had launched the aviation age with their flight 7 years earlier at Kitty Hawk. The fellow on the right is a less well-known aviation pioneer, Albert Adams Merrill. A native of Massachusetts, Merrill began sketching out designs for flying machines while he was still in high school. In 1894, shortly after he graduated, he founded the Boston Aeronautical Society. In 1899, he published his first and only novel, The Great Awakening, the story of the 22nd century. It depicted a utopian future in which, among other things, everyone flies their own plane and drives electric cars. The state owns all property and wealth is equally distributed. By the time of the Boston Air Meet, Merrill had learned to fly at the Wright Brothers Airfield in Dayton, Ohio. He also designed and built the planes he flew. This is an early example of one of them, and was known throughout the aviation community as a skilled, gifted inventor. When he moved to California several years later to work as an accountant for Price Waterhouse, which was his day job, someone brought his name to the attention of George Ellery Hale and Robert Millikan, who were then in the process of transforming Pasadena's Troop College into the California Institute of Technology. Millikan and Hale both saw tremendous potential in aviation and aeronautics and were eager to have their new institution assume a leading role in the exciting new field. In 1916, they had recruited Harry Bateman, a young British mathematical physicist whose research interests included aeronautics, to teach troops first class on the subject. His main job, however, was to oversee the design and construction on the troop campus of Southern California's first wind tunnel. The earliest wind tunnels were developed in the mid-19th century. They have been used since the dawn of the 20th century to investigate the design and performance of land and air vehicles under a variety of wind and air conditions, and to diagnose structural and functional problems during the development phase. The 52-foot-long troop tunnel, designed to test how air currents affected parts of planes or scale models of complete planes, was completed in 1918. Shortly afterward, Millikan and Hale hired Merrill to oversee and operate the tunnel, teach airplane design, and start a small campus program in airplane fabrication. He also taught accounting. For the next several years, Bateman, the Cambridge-educated theorist, and Merrill, the hands-on, self-taught engineer, constituted the school's aeronautics department. Bateman taught classes that focused on the application of mathematical theories to aerodynamics, and Merrill and his students designed and built airplanes and tested their creations in the wind tunnel. In 1920, the year troop became Caltech, Douglas Aircraft opened Southern California's first major production plant in nearby Santa Monica. Always eager to cultivate productive relationships with local industry, Robert Millikan saw new research and development opportunities for Caltech Aeronautics. But that required fresh funding for expanded initiatives, and at the time, none was forthcoming. Within a few years, however, The program got a boost from another enthusiastic flyboy, one who happened to be heir to a mining fortune. Henry Guggenheim had flown military aircraft in World War I. This picture of him dates to some years after that. In 1925, he and his father, multimillionaire turned philanthropist Daniel Guggenheim, announced plans to fund aeronautics research centers at selected American universities. In his pitch to the Guggenheim Foundation, Millikan emphasized Caltech's experience in wind tunnel design and operation, Merrill's track record of building innovative airplanes, and the obvious advantages of Caltech's proximity to the new Douglas aircraft facility. In 1926, Caltech received $500,000 of Guggenheim funding to create a comprehensive graduate program in aeronautics, complete with a state-of-the-art wind tunnel and a dedicated aeronautics building in which to house it, the Daniel A. Guggenheim Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology, or GALCIT, as it is known to this day. Aeronautics in those days was very much a young person's field, so perhaps it is no surprise that the two individuals most responsible for the work on the new wind tunnel had barely completed their PhDs. Both would go on to become founding GALCIT faculty and esteemed aeronautical engineers. One was Clark Millikan, Robert Millikan's son, who, as a colleague later said, had been nutty about aeronautics since childhood. After undergraduate studies at Yale, he returned to Caltech to earn his physics doctorate with Harry Bateman, Caltech's resident aerodynamicist. Millikan's somewhat unlikely collaborator was Arthur Klein, who entered Troop in 1916, intending to coast to a mechanical engineering degree. Unlike the conscientious, studious Clark Millikan, a credit to his father in every way, Klein was a self-described campus hellraiser who, as he relates in his Caltech Archives oral history, was expelled from Troop for what he calls technological pranks, that is to say, rewiring the electricity in campus labs and modifying the Merrill wind tunnel to blow air the wrong way. When he was readmitted in 1921, Troop had become Caltech, and Klein decided to stay on and pursue a PhD in physics with Robert Millikan. In his oral history, he maintains that it was either that or being forced into his family's thriving clothing business. I didn't want to sell socks, shoes, and underwear, he said. I've always been a bad salesman. Klein was, however, a superb mechanical engineer. He had just completed his physics PhD when he became interested in what was happening in the lab next door, where Clark Millikan and another graduate student were assembling part of Albert Merrill's latest plane and doing very preliminary wind tunnel work. In Klein's estimation, they were hopeless mechanically. They did the stress analysis and aerodynamics very well, but just how you put things together, they didn't know. His instinct to lend a helping hand rapidly evolved into a full-time engineering job, as he recalls in this audio segment of his oral history.
I would go over and help Millikan and a man named Hicks, who was a graduate student, and work on these things and try to straighten out their efforts. I continued to do this both on the airplane, on the apparatus for the wind tunnel, and on the wind tunnel itself. Came the summer, and everyone who was officially in the aeronautics department went on vacation. I was the only person who was around. As time went on, I became more and more involved in this, and pretty soon I was building Guggenheim Laboratory wind tunnel with the airplane, and I wasn't even in the aeronautics department. I was still in physics. I guess the department decided they better regularize this, and so I was given an appointment in aeronautics. Mm-hmm. And I took over these jobs officially. Mm-hmm. As a consequence, I designed a good part of the wind tunnel, all the mechanical features, the wind tunnel rigging, the balances, and so forth. And the wind tunnel turned out to be extremely successful. Mm-hmm. Extraordinarily successful, in fact. which was largely due to the fact that I was too lazy to make it as complicated as some of the wind tunnels were.
In 1926, the Hungarian-born mathematician, physicist, and engineer Theodor von Karman, widely considered the world's foremost authority in aerodynamics, took a break from his faculty position in Germany to visit Caltech. He presented lectures, advised on Gaussit's plans for its wind tunnel, and was encouraged by Robert Millikan to start thinking about a permanent move to Pasadena. Von Karman was renowned throughout Europe for his expertise in both theoretical and experimental aeronautics, and for the range of his scientific interests. But he was increasingly unhappy with what he saw as the rising tide of militarism and anti-Semitism in Germany, and open to the idea of emigrating to the United States. Looking over preliminary designs for the Gaussit wind tunnel, von Karman pointed out that among other problems, the tunnel, as currently envisioned, would not only be deficient in energy, but would actually outstrip the size of the new building in which it was supposed to reside. As Klein recalls, along with many other refinements and improvements, von Karman proposed a closed-circuit wind tunnel, both more compact in size and considerably more efficient in operation. Nearly all of his recommendations were implemented. During that same visit, von Karman also looked at Albert Merrill's plans for his latest plane. He saw potential issues there too, but these became moot when the plane was subsequently destroyed in a fire. Merrill then began collaborating with Clark Millikan on its successor, the CIT-9, whose chief innovation was that it had no tail and relied exclusively on the movement of its wings to maintain balance and stability. Its unorthodox appearance earned it the nickname Dill Pickle. In 1928, the Dill Pickle made an impressive public debut at a Los Angeles air meet. Unfortunately, not long afterward, it crashed during a takeoff and was damaged beyond repair. There were no injuries, but quarrels erupted as Merrill and Millikan each blamed each other for crucial design flaws. The outcome was probably inevitable. Merrill left Caltech later that year and set up a private aviation consulting firm. His departure marked the end of a Caltech era, one that the school's new generation of trained aeronautical engineers increasingly viewed as an outmoded time of airplane development by aging amateurs. In Merrill's place, Caltech recruited a number of Douglas Company engineers to teach courses in aviation engineering and design, a move that further strengthened the growing ties between Caltech and local aircraft manufacturers. The Guggenheim Laboratory was completed in 1928. A year later, von Karman joined Caltech as a research associate in aeronautics. In 1930, he was named professor of aeronautics and founding director of Gaussit, a position he would hold until 1949 when he was succeeded by Clark Millikan. His tenure would establish Caltech as the world's preeminent center for aeronautics and later aerospace research, and lead among many other accomplishments to the creation of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In 1963, von Karman became the first recipient of the National Medal of Science, presented to him by President John F. Kennedy. The Gaussit wind tunnel went into public operation in 1930. This photo from that year, with a number of Gaussit personnel, gives a sense of the size and scale of the facility. It rose through 4 stories of the new aeronautics building, filling a space 46 feet high, 100 feet long, and 25 feet wide. Powered by a World War I submarine motor, its propellers were able to generate wind speeds up to an exceptionally high 200 miles an hour. Standing underneath it, starting 4th from left, is Gaussit's core group of founding scientists, Clark Millikan, Harry Bateman, Theodor von Karman, and Arthur Klein. The tunnel's superior capabilities became apparent as soon as Gaussit began its first tests of commercial aircraft, starting with a scale model of the 6-seater Northrop Alpha 1. The tests revealed that at high speeds, the plane would start to vibrate uncontrollably, a problem its designers had not anticipated. Von Karman traced the shaking to a phenomenon known as vortex shedding, which he himself had been the first to identify and characterize 2 decades earlier. Klein and Millikan engineered a solution by placing a stabilizing device between the plane's wing and its fuselage. This first Northrop Alpha, which went on to fly for TWA and later the military, helped pave the way for later generations of larger, more sophisticated passenger planes. The wind tunnel model was preserved and is now at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance, California. In the successful aftermath of those first tests, the Gaussett Wind Tunnel became the go-to test bed for the Southern California aircraft industry, as well as an indispensable research tool for Caltech aeronautics faculty and students. Other companies using the tunnel in the 1930s included Boeing, Lockheed, Hughes, and of course Douglas, which would ultimately conduct tests of its entire DC aircraft series 1 through 10 at the Gaussett facility. Here we see Clark Millikan and Arthur Klein in 1932 with a scale model of the DC-1. I'd like to conclude with some 1928 footage of the flight of the innovative but ill-fated Dill Pickle, the last plane that Caltech produced in its short-lived era of independent airplane design and fabrication. This clip comes to us courtesy of YouTube, and I hope you enjoy this look back at a unique moment in Caltech history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heidi. Our next presentation will be by Elisa Picchio, and it will be on the subject of the Cosmopolitan Club and Students of Color.
Thank you and welcome. Most of the presentations in this series have emphasized the common backgrounds, interests, and passions of Caltech students and faculty, who were very ethnically homogeneous and all male. Nevertheless, some diversity could be found even in those times. And my presentation today will bring together people who were different from those around them. Although Thorpe College of Technology and then Caltech initially drew from a very local pool of students and only occasionally from California or from other states, it may come as a surprise that the first 3 international students arrived already in 1915, 2 from Japan and 1 from Australia. Until 1920, we see a few more hailing from Costa Rica, Denmark, the Philippines, and Mexico. In the 1920s, there are a few others from many other countries in the world: Canada, Sweden, Belgium, Russia, China, and Korea. The gentleman highlighted in this picture of the 1916 freshman class must be Eiitsu Ishiyama from Taisho, Japan, one of the first 3 international students to arrive at Thorpe College of Technology. A few years later, Lamberto de la Rocha from Durango, Mexico, was probably the first student from our southern neighbor, He entered as a sophomore in the academic year 1920-21. He was a member of the American Society of Civil Engineering since the formation of its chapter at Caltech, shown here in 1922. He was awarded a BS in Civil Engineering in 1923. He was known as Dell. His yearbook entry states that his arguments were so convincing that he should have been a lawyer. The number of foreign students grew steadily, and in 1924-1925, the bulletin shows 13 among the undergraduates. There were also 2 graduate students from British Columbia and Switzerland. This was probably the reason for the creation of the Cosmopolitan Club, formed in February 1925 under the direction of the YMCA. The purpose of these clubs was to promote fellowship among students of different nationalities and to foster the universal peace movement. These clubs are the, quote, result of a youth movement which has endeavored to help overthrow all the international jealousies and hatred and to set up a spirit of cooperation and friendship, end quote, says the Big T of 1925. Each dinner meeting was dedicated to a foreign country and organized by students representing it. In 1925, interesting and educational banquets were staged for China, Russia, Japan, Mexico, Holland, Germany, France, and United States, culminating in a big multinational feast. In the first year, the club had 26 members, including 6 out of the 13 international students, 1 from Russia, Alex Koneber, and 5 from China, one of which was president and another one was secretary. Other cosmopolitan clubs were born in colleges across the nation in the first decades of the century. It is likely they originated from the Italian Federation of Corda Fratres, dating from Brotherly Hearts, which was created in Turin in 1898. The Federation, the oldest international student organization, advocated for the universal ideas of peace, brotherhood, and solidarity among students of all countries. At the time, out of 20,000 college students in Italy, 1/3 became members. After World War I, the Italian organization clashed with the ideology of fascism and faded away, but its spirit lived on in other countries and certainly in the United States. Let us follow the story of some of the first international members of Caltech's Cosmopolitan Club. Tomizo Suzuki graduated in civil engineering in 1928, and we see him here in his regalia. He returned to Japan and was a technical advisor for the engineering district of Okinawa, and after the war, a civil engineer for the US Army Japan Construction Field Office in Tokyo. In 1956, still true to the educational spirit of the Cosmopolitan Club, he writes in a correspondence to Caltech's Engineering and Science. Japan may be a very hard country for foreigners to understand, because although she may be classed as a highly industrialized nation, many things seem to be contradictory, because the new exists apparently in harmony with the old, side by side. Thus, we see many girls who are dressed elegantly like the Parisians or New Yorkers, but most of them may live in Japanese-style homes, eat Japanese meals 3 times a day, and continue to observe age-old Japanese customs. After all, it may be safe for us to say that Japan is still in the state of making in a world of uncertainties. Another Cosmopolitan Club member, Alex Koneber from Russia, graduated in electrical engineering in 1926. Unlike his classmate Suzuki, he stayed local. He was employed by the Southern California Edison Company, where in 1945, he was the senior electrical engineer in the operating department. In that year, he wrote an article for ENS magazine. Pictures of the Cosmopolitan Club continue to appear in the yearbook, showing somewhat small groups. The members advertise themselves as brothers under the skin and believers in the universal brotherhood of man. The club participated in the Southern California Federation of Cosmopolitan Clubs, holding joint meetings and banquets with other colleges, at which international and racial problems are discussed. In 1931, the club roster lists two interesting members who are respectively president and vice president. William Pickering from Christchurch, New Zealand, who will be a physics PhD in 1936, and director of JPL from 1954 to 1976, and Grant Venerable from Los Angeles, the first African-American students at Caltech. Venerable became club president in 1932. In that year, the club held monthly meetings, a large banquet in the dugout, where the guest speakers was Miss Maud Russell, an expert on China. The club had also 3 members of the faculty. In 1933, the club became independent from the Y and was mentioned briefly in the 1934 Big T. From 1935, we have no more news about it, so we assume interest in it faded. Back to Grant Venerable in 1931, when he joined Caltech as a junior, transferring from UCLA, from which he had been expelled for some sort of bureaucratic issue. His family moved from Kansas City, Missouri in 1919 and came to the San Bernardino area. Grant entered UCLA as a math major and a member of the Alpha Phi Alpha, the first African-American intercollegiate Greek-lettered fraternity. He was a member of the Blue Sea Society, a letterman organization spanning football, basketball, baseball, track, and tennis. The most notable member of the society was Jackie Robinson, who was the first at UCLA to get jacket letters in for sports. Grant was president of the Agenda Club, a Black student organization, and he wrote in the student newspaper to support the cause of equality for Black Americans. At Caltech, Grant decided to pursue a degree in civil engineering and joined the Caltech chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineering. He remained very active in several student organizations, and he competed in Caltech's track and field team. Beyond the Cosmopolitan Club, he was an officer of the YMCA. The association hosted many lectures, organized participation in religious conferences, and prepared the handbook for the incoming class. Grant was also in the exhibit day committee. The day was an open house of sorts, which welcomed prospective students from the high schools in Southern California and gave the students at the Institute also the opportunity to show the school to their relatives and friends. The day was a huge endeavor campus-wide, featuring faculty lectures in Culbertson Hall, science demonstrations, tour of the Guggenheim Laboratory wind tunnel and other facilities, and as the name says, many exhibits. Venerable put an application to live in one of the new student houses, which had been completed in 1931. Robert Millikan consulted the Board of Trustees on the issue of allowing a Black student to live there. The answer was affirmative, but the cost was prohibited for Venerable, who supported himself and paid tuition with odd jobs and by working as butler in Beverly Hills. So he remained in a small off-campus apartment. With the end of the fraternities and the opening of the new student houses, many students living off-campus found themselves isolated from social activities. To help these students integrate, a non-resident club was created that very year. Venerable was a member and is seen in the first row of this group picture. The club organized many successful affairs, including a treasure hunt, a barn dance, a gambling night on registration day, and more. The old dorm provided space for a non-resident lounge run by the club. Visiting it on any afternoon or evening, you would have found lots of young men playing cards and board games, having lively discussion and listening to the radio. 1932 was probably memorable for Grant for two reasons. He graduated of course, and on the morning of Friday, January 15, 1932, Pasadena was covered in a blanket of snow for the first time in 47 years. Here's Grant's name in the 1932 commencement program. And here's his picture, his yearbook picture. After graduation, Venerable was unable to find work in his field, like many of his colleagues in the depths of the Great Depression. The next year, he went to Montana, where he spent a year trying to make his ounce gold mine profitable. Back in California, he took a job as insurance agent with the Golden State Mutual, one of the first companies to offer life insurance to Black customers in Los Angeles. In a 1986 interview, the former CEO of Golden State Mutual, Ivan Houston, remembers, Grant Venerable, a very outstanding person. He subsequently, as the work came along, was able to apply his talents where they were appreciated, but he was really an excellent salesperson and became a very excellent sales manager too. Beginning in 1940, through an old Caltech connection, Venerable found several jobs in mining engineering and later joined the Hayward Spyglass Company, where he found use for his expertise in optics. In 1945, together with his brother-in-law, William Tatum, Venerable entered the hotel business. They later bought the Georgia Haley Manufacturing Company, which produced and distributed chalkboard eraser to major school districts across the country. He managed the company until his death in 1986. Grant married Thelma Scott. They settled on West 36th Street, close to the US campus neighborhood, and had 3 children. We don't have any record of Venerable's technical achievements, but we know that he was passionate about science. His son, Delbert, a 1970 physical chemistry PhD, remembers that he would enjoy reading the Book of Knowledge, encyclopedia for children at home, and then ask his father many questions. Grant was full of ways of demonstrating things, says Delbert. He could demonstrate the eclipse. We had a little globe, a model globe, and he would have a light bulb and a lamp without the shade, and he would have a little baseball that would be the moon, and show how this baseball would cast a shadow on this little globe from the light. I got so excited by things like that. The Venerable family endowed a book fund with the Caltech Library in Grant's honor. Earlier this year, Grant Venerable was inducted in the Caltech Athletics Hall of Honor class of 2020. And we should stop here, since our presentations cover the 1910s and 1920s. But we will stretch out to 1937 for the arrival of a graduate student whose story is worth sharing, James Duval. He was Caltech's first African-American graduate student, but he was exceptional for other reasons too. He brought to Caltech a fresh bronze medal from the 1936 Berlin Olympics, where he gained the podium for the 400-meter dash, which we see here. Duval was born in 1912 in San Antonio, Texas, but grew up in California. He was an undergraduate and then a master's student in chemistry at UCLA and worked in the chemistry lab as a research assistant. He was the first president of the UCLA Graduate Students Association. He moved to Caltech in 1937 to work on his PhD in chemistry. At Caltech, he worked with Don Yost for the first year and then worked for 2 years with Linus Pauling in electron diffraction. In a 1988 interview, Luval recalls that those were marvelous years. Linus used to come down and visit us almost every night. Certainly, he'd see us 2 or 3 times a week to find out what we were doing. He always knew what we were doing, knew more about it than we did. I worked with a small group there. I worked with Dave Stevenson and Werner Shoemaker, both of whom became quite well known in their fields. There were postdocs when I was a pre-doc. So frequently at night, I had to go home and study like mad and try to figure out what the two of them had been talking about that day. But the years I spent with Linus were absolutely marvelous years for me. The appreciation was mutual. Pauline wrote of him in a 1938 letter that Mr. Luval has made an excellent record in his graduate work with us. He is classed in the upper group of our graduate students, despite the fact that the graduate students are very carefully selected and have in general great ability. He graduated in 1940 with a thesis on electron diffraction, which had been introduced in chemistry by his advisor Pauline as a tool to study the structure of molecules. After Caltech, Luval taught for a year at Fisk University, an historical Black university in Nashville, Tennessee, but found it a poor fit for his focus on research. So he left and got himself a job at Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. He was happy there. Here's Pauline writing to Luval. Dear Jimmy, I'm glad to learn that you are pleased with your work and that you like Rochester. Things are going well here. Much of the preliminary work has been done on the Tiselius apparatus, and I hope that it will be working in a few months. Luval did research at Kodak for 10 years, first in microphotography. Then he had a stint with the Office of Scientific and Research Development during World War II. Back at Kodak, he worked on development agents and the theoretical group. When asked if these were things that his studies at Caltech prepared him for, he answered, well, part of these things you had to learn to do. But you have to remember, at Caltech, the idea is to train you to be a research scientist, not in a very narrow field, but to train you in such a way that you have a very good general background in the whole area in which you are specializing. So if you were asked to take on a problem in some area other than that which you are familiar with, you could sit down and in not too long a time become familiar enough with it. So you could undertake the research that was necessary. After Kodak, Luval went back and forth between academia and industry, and in his career as director of the undergraduate chemistry laboratories at Stanford. In 1985, UCLA named the new student center Luval Commons, and in 1987, he received the Alumni Distinguished Service Award from California Institute of Technology for outstanding achievement in his chosen field. Luval commented, "This is the only award that Caltech gives. It gives no degree awards at all. It gives this to a few alumni each year. They get a certificate and a medal with the motto of Caltech, the truth shall make you free. I was amazed that I got this award, and I feel very, very honored in getting it from Caltech." In my presentation, I focused on the lives of a few individuals whose stories made it to us through time, and who show us that Caltech had some diversity even in the early 20th century. The struggles and accomplishments give us a distinct sense of what it must have been to be a techer from a different background than most in those crucial initial years of Caltech. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, for that wonderful presentation. And now I will turn things over to Loma Karklins for our last presentation of the evening on origins of the Athenaeum.
Good evening, and thank you for having joined us this summer. Long an admirer of London's Athenaeum Club, as early as the 1920s, George Ellery Hale had conceived of such a setting for scholars here at Caltech, where members and friends could hear discussions of topics of interest by those best prepared to tell of the fascinating developments in science and art, literature, history, and government. Founded in 1824, London's Athenaeum Club was built with the intent of being a private club to an association of, and I quote, individuals known for their scientific or literary attainments, artists of eminence in any class of the fine arts, and noblemen and gentlemen distinguished as liberal patrons of science, literature, or the arts. Built in the neoclassical style, with its namesake Athena, the goddess of wisdom, towering over the entrance's portico, and a further nod to classical Greek architecture with the addition along the roof's eaves of a copy of a marble frieze originally salvaged from the Parthenon, the club included a library, a dining room, a drawing room, and a suite of guest rooms. In 1926, with the founding of the Associates of the California Institute of Technology, together with Hale's personal and professional connection to both the Mount Wilson Observatory and the Huntington Library and Art Gallery, both growing in stature and becoming world-renowned, Hale felt the time was ripe to create such a gracious and convenient place, as he liked to put it, that could serve the social, cultural, and intellectual interests of its members. By 1928, Caltech's trustees seriously began discussing the need to develop the residential and social portion of the campus. The decision was made to enlist the talents of Gordon Kaufman, British-born and a graduate of the London Polytechnic Institute before settling in Southern California. Kaufman, who had distinguished himself in 1926 with a master plan for Claremont's Scripps College for Women, would be tasked with designing a cluster of student undergraduate houses for Caltech just east and south of Troop Hall. Kaufman was also asked to draw up architectural plans for the Athenaeum. And once funding was secured, Hale's long-awaited Athenaeum could become a reality. Such funding would, in fact, be provided by Caltech trustee Alan C. Balch and his wife Janet Jacks Balch, who in 1929 transferred to Caltech a gift of stocks and bonds from which the proceeds of their sale netted Caltech approximately $500,000. Timing was crucial, for the securities were sold just prior to the stock market crash of 1929. Their generous gift would not only cover the cost of erecting the building, but would also include the equipment and furnishings, together with the adjacent tennis courts and landscaping. As to who were the Balches, Janet Jacks came from a wealthy landowning family in Monterey County, and Alan, after graduating from Cornell, began a career as an engineer involved in setting up electrical utilities in Seattle, Portland, and Southern California. Once he and Janet moved to Los Angeles in 1896, Alan joined in a collaboration with William Kirchhoff and Henry Huntington to either found, manage, or own 3 very large electrical power utilities in Southern California, which were eventually sold to the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, their initial investment bringing them millions. When the time came to design the Athenaeum, Janet and Alan Balch already had an acquaintance with Gordon Kaufman when in 1929 he designed the administrative building at Scripps College, named in Janet Jacks Balch's honor, as well as having designed a series of women's residence halls at their alma mater, Cornell, dedicated in 1929 and named in their honor. As discussed in a previous presentation, California's architecture of the 1920s and early 30s was heavily influenced by numerous styles, those being Mission and Mediterranean Revival, and Spanish Baroque and Spanish Colonial Revival. Eventually, there developed a fusion, taking various elements of each and creating a hybrid that some would call the California style or the Californian. And the Athenaeum is a prime example of such an amalgam. Berkeley architect and editor of the Pacific Coast Architect Journal, Harris Allen, probably best summed up this eclectic architectural style in an article he wrote for his journal in 1928. He said, "We have tried almost everything and by degrees eliminated the misfits and picked out good bits, so that consciously or unconsciously, we have gravitated toward the type of architecture that seemed most congenial to our traditions, our climate, and our environment. It isn't Spanish, nor Mission, nor Italian, nor colonial. Many people have tried to call it Mediterranean, which perhaps most nearly resembles our Pacific Riviera. But in the end, it has come to being called what it is, just Californian." Caltech's Athenaeum beautifully illustrates the signature elements of this Californian style. Flat or low-pitched tile roofs, arches and colonnades, a courtyard, wood-beam ceilings, decorative tiles, terracotta pots, carved wood, intricate ironwork, and natural stucco walls. And here is the Athenaeum as it looks today, after various renovations over the years, still true to its original details. In 1933, Kaufmann's designs for both the student houses and the Athenaeum would earn him 2 certificates of honor from the Southern California chapter of the American Institute of Architects. However, the era for this California style and emphasis on architectural ornamentation would soon close. With the onset of the Depression followed by World War II, building projects ceased. And by the war's end, modernist architects ascended with their minimalist approach, their designs stripped of detail, and their preferred building materials being glass, steel, and reinforced concrete. Though the Athenaeum would be completed and opened in October of 1930, the first formal Caltech Associates dinner would take place in January of 1931, highlighted by Einstein's arrival during Caltech's winter term, when he would take up residency as a research associate. This was a highly anticipated visit, as Robert Millikan had made numerous attempts in the past to entice Einstein to come to Pasadena. Besides having met Millikan a decade earlier, Einstein was familiar with the scientific work being done by astronomer George Ellery Hale, physicists Paul Epstein and Richard Tolman, and physicist and applied mathematician turned aeronautics expert Theodore von Karman, all in residence at Caltech. And the added possibility of visiting Mount Wilson's 100-inch telescope, famous for being the world's largest at the time, was a further enticement. This would also give Einstein the occasion to meet Edwin Hubble, who in 1924 had discovered other galaxies in what seemed to be an ever-expanding universe, contradicting Einstein's original belief that the universe was static. This then would prove a great opportunity for the meeting of scientific minds to discuss theory and experiment. The arrival of Einstein and his wife Elsa met with great fanfare. Arriving in Pasadena on December 31st, they were immediately whisked off the following morning to view the Tournament of Roses parade, seen here with their host Arthur Fleming seated next to Einstein, who made the arrangements with Security First National Bank's Vice President John Willis Baer to have the Einsteins view the parade from the window of his private office on Colorado Boulevard. And Hollywood was quite captivated with Einstein as well. Learning that Einstein was an admirer of his films, Charlie Chaplin invited Albert and Elsa to the world premiere of his newest film, City Lights. But it was Caltech and the opportunity to discuss science and theory with respected colleagues that held the greatest temptation and would have a major impact on Einstein and his thinking. As scholar Abraham Hoffman so succinctly stated, influenced by the investigations of Richard Tolman and Edwin Hubble, Einstein's theory of the universe was profoundly changed during his visit to Caltech. The implication secured Caltech's reputation as a world-class scientific institute, one that would stand at the forefront of aero and outer space exploration and research in future decades. Einstein's visit to Pasadena would also afford him what would become his last chance to confer with physicist Albert A. Michelson, who he'd first met in 1921 and whose light speed measurements taken in the San Gabriel Mountains in the 1920s had proven critical to verifying Einstein's theory of relativity. Michelson would die a few months later. In this photo, taken January 7th, 1931, at the main entrance to the Athenaeum, the three Nobel Prize winning physicists are featured in front. From left to right, Albert A. Michelson, who in 1907 became the first American to win a Nobel Prize in Science, Albert Einstein, having received his in 1921, and Robert Millikan, who was awarded his in 1923. Behind them, from left to right, Walter Adams, who at the time was the director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, Walter Meyer, Einstein's assistant, who traveled with him that year, and Max Farrand, who was the first director of the Huntington Library. And here you also see the Los Angeles Times reporting of the event with the comment, "The lure that attracted him here, an invitation to make full use of the facilities available in the three great research institutions of this vicinity, was tendered today to Dr. Albert Einstein." The following week, on January 15th, with some 200 guests in attendance, the formal dinner in honor of Dr. and Mrs. Albert Einstein was held. And among the guests were these illustrious gentlemen of science, as well as a few noteworthy Caltech associates. Seated left to right are the three Nobelists, Millikan, Einstein, and Michelson. And next to Michelson is the astronomer and Lick Observatory director, William Wallace Campbell. Standing behind them from left to right, astronomer and member of staff at the Mount Wilson Observatory, Charles St. John, Walter Meyer, Edwin Hubble, William Monroe, who was a history professor at Caltech at the time and a major player in the administrative concerns regarding the building of the Athenaeum and student houses. Next to him is Richard Tolman. Then comes Alan Balch, who at this point became the president of the Athenaeum, Walter Adams, and the last gentleman is Russell Ballard, who was now the president of the Caltech Associates, as well as, in his professional life, the president of the Southern California Edison Company. The following day, the Pasadena Star-News would report on the occasion, highlighting that Einstein had singled out a number of Pasadenans whose researches helped considerably to bring about proof of his relativity and other theories. At the end of the academic year, Caltech students would be reminded of Einstein's first visit in their 1931 Big T yearbook, where a sketch of Einstein would be accompanied by Einstein's personal message to his dear young friends, as he called them, with the following: "We are indeed in the era and also in the native land of applied science. However, concern for man himself and his fate must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors." Also celebrated in that yearbook would be Caltech's newest building, the Athenaeum, seen here and acknowledged to be Caltech's modern Olympus. And so it came to pass, Hale's vision of a gracious, convenient place where those best prepared to tell of the fascinating developments in science and art, literature, history, and government could now mingle and share their knowledge and wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Loma. And so we will now rejoin you and have an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. So please feel free to ask questions using the question and answer feature while you're thinking of your questions. I will note that this is the 6th and last event in our series this summer. And if you have missed any of the prior 5, you can find them all on our event website, which we'll put the URL for in the chat for you. And so you should feel free to experience the recordings that we already have there, as well as the bibliography if we spark your interest in any particular thread of the story and you want to do more reading. We have a question from one of our colleagues. Did Einstein and his wife live at the Athenaeum during their first 1931 visit?
Actually, they did not. They basically had a home that was rented, and I'm assuming those arrangements were made by others, but there was a small little home that they rented. And they would stay, however, at the Athenaeum the following 2 years in 32 and 33.
And we also have a question from someone who's curious to take a closer look at Einstein's letter from the 1931 Big T. And so I think that we can pass along. So the entire run of the Big T's is digitized and is on the web, caltechcampuspubs.library.caltech.edu, including that 1931 volume. So you're welcome to have a look yourself, or if you'd like us to point you to it, you're welcome to send us a note at archives@caltech.edu, and we'd be happy to send you a link that will take you right to that page. A question, and Heidi and Elisa, I don't know if we have you on video. If you'd like to join us on video, please do. We have an aeronautics question. Did Merrill design and build the Merrill Wind Tunnel?
It was largely designed prior to his arrival, but his role in managing it and upgrading it, I think, caused it to be associated with his name.
Thank you. Here's a rumor I've heard before. One of our audience members has heard that Einstein used tunnels to get around campus. Is it true?
I don't, we have no proof, and I think it's just one of those great myths that everybody loves to tell, but we don't really have any proof whatsoever whether such a thing ever happened. So I can't verify it one way or the other.
We can't prove he didn't, but yes, we don't have any evidence that that was the case, absolutely. In the 1932 to 33 visit of the Einsteins, did they live at the Ath full time?
As far as I know, they did. They would take sojourns. They both loved Palm Springs and the desert. And so I'm sure there were weekends or maybe several days that they would, together with friends and colleagues in the Southern California area would travel. But as far as I know, yes, they were permanent, or that was their permanent residency while in Pasadena or in the LA area.
Any further questions from our audience? We'll give you one moment. The address of their initial cottage. Another Einstein residence question.
I actually did come across that, and I'm not sure if I have it in front of me at the moment, but there is, I didn't, I have that
So yeah, I
information.
can answer that. Yeah, I can answer that. I'm actually reading from your FAQ factor on our website, and it says that Einstein lived in a bungalow at 707 South Oakland Avenue.
Okay, and is it still there? This was the other part of our question.
Someone could do Google Maps and find
yes.
out.
See, absolutely, absolutely. So we don't know off the top of our heads if it's still there. Any further questions for our panel? This is your last chance for the moment to play Stump the Archivist, although we will certainly have more opportunities for you to visit with us in the future. Well, I want to then take this final opportunity to thank our audience for their loyalty and their interest in this history and for joining us for each of these opportunities. And our panelists, thank you, Elisa, Heidi, Loma, Judith Goodstein, who's here with us, who's been a guest panelist a few times. And I want to thank our colleagues in academic media technologies who have made the Zoomification of this possible and have enabled us to reach all of you in your homes. We will let you know when we have future events and future opportunities to engage with the Caltech archives. And we will certainly be sure to let those of you who've been able to attend these presentations know when we reopen our exhibit, Becoming Caltech, Building a Research Community, which these presentations accompany. So we look forward to a future free of disease in which we can invite all of you into our space to enjoy the exhibit with us. Thank you all once again. Have a great evening. More to come.